Hi there, it's July the 16th and we're continuing our progress through Paul's letter to the Romans, and we are in chapter 3 and we're reading from verses 9 to 31. These are some of the most key verses in terms of Paul's understanding of the good news of Jesus Messiah and what he has done both for Jews and for non-Jews. We saw that earlier in the chapter, Paul sets up this discussion, this questioning and answer, rather like the students in a yeshiva who work in what we call chavura, in partnership, the two of them. And so it's as though Paul has this invisible Jewish partner who's speaking to him and asking him these questions. And this questioning continues when the questioner asks, are we not better off then? Are we any better off? Are we not the better side? Jews have much more advantage. And Paul says no, because actually both Jews and Greeks are, non-Jews, are under the power of sin. Whatever happens, however much we try and keep the Torah, however much Jews have the Torah, say we have Torah, we have favoured status with God, actually what the Torah does, Paul says, is it leads us to an understanding, to a recognition of sin. And he quotes extensively from the Hebrew scriptures to back this up, that the Hebrew scriptures are acknowledging that sin is a real problem. The failure to live up to all that God has for us, the failure to be who we should be, the failure to be the glory carriers that God has made us. And it's speaking to those, particularly the Torah speaks to those who are under that Torah, who are under that law, who are under that guidance. No one, says Paul, can be declared in the right. No one can be declared justified. The law is a mirror, it's not a soap, and therefore the law shows us just how much, and particularly the law showing Israel just how much they've come short of the glory of God. But now, says Paul, this famous statement of now, but now, something's changed, says Paul, something's different. There's now an established fact, which means that the law is no longer the one that controls, that holds us. He says that God's righteousness, or as N.T. Wright puts it in his translation, God's covenant justice has been displayed. What Jesus has done in fulfillment of all God's purposes, he's become the fulfillment of the Torah. He's become the one who allows us entrance into God's presence. Because without that, we're trapped in this being less than who we are, because we've come short of God's glory. We've not reached God's glory because we failed it. But God has provided by his covenant grace, by his bonded promise, by his promise to Abraham, he's provided the way for us to come into his presence. And it says in verse 25 that God presented Jesus, and the Greek word is a very key word. He says Jesus became the elasterion. Now, elasterion has been translated in old translations as propitiation, and that's a very strange word, but it basically means as a sacrifice that keeps God quiet, that pacifies God, that we have an angry God and God has to be somehow pacified, and therefore Jesus has been the one who has taken the anger of God. That's not the correct understanding of this word elasterion, because elasterion is the Greek translation of the word kaporet in Hebrew. In the Old Testament, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word kaporet means the mercy seat, the covering over the ark, the place where man and God met together. As the blood was sprinkled on the mercy seat, that is where God meets us. And what Paul is saying here is that Jesus is the place where God meets with us, where God has reconciled us to himself, where God has dealt with sin. He's not punished Jesus, he's broken the power of sin. And therefore, it's in Jesus, it's Messiah Jesus, it's his fulfillment of the covenant promises that is the key. No longer the Torah. The Torah is not dismissed, the Torah is important, the Torah is God's instruction, but actually we now receive our entrance into the presence of God through this mercy seat, through this place of meeting of God and man in Jesus. And therefore Paul says at the end of our reading, boasting, my ability to do it is completely taken away. There's no boast anymore in whether I keep the law and how good I am and how much I do good things and good works. It's actually just about God's grace. God makes the declaration about whether I am right, and he says on the same basis to those who are circumcised and those who are not circumcised, to Jews and Gentiles, is now on the basis of faith, of trust, of commitment to this righteousness of God, to this covenant justice that God has set forth. And Paul is going on to explain that in the last chapter of this first section of Romans, in chapter 4, when he talks about Abraham. What tremendous news this is for us who are not Jews, as well as for Jews, that we have access to the Father through his goodness, at the meeting place of the cross, at the place where Jesus comes to us as God, and he connects with us as God. We can rejoice in that wonderful fact today, all day long. Have a very good July the 16th.